In their attempt to discredit the God of the Bible, the atheistic community has come up with the problem of evil, pain, and suffering. It's an age-old problem, the idea that if there is a loving God and He is all-powerful, then why do evil, bad things happen to humans? Like I said, it's not new. Epicurus in the 3rd century BC said this. He said, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then He's not omnipotent. Is He able but not willing? Then He's malevolent. Is He both able and willing? Then whence comes evil? Is He neither able nor willing? Then why call Him God?" You see, the problem being framed there is that if there is an all-loving God, then that all-loving God, if He had the power to stop all of human pain and suffering, then He would do that. Since the 3rd century BC, most atheists in the atheistic community have presented this idea as evidence against the God of the Bible. Listen to what Charles Templeton said. He said, "If there is an omnipotent and loving God, why does He permit earthquakes, hurricanes, droughts, and other natural disasters to kill indiscriminately tens of thousands of men, women, and children?" You see, there again the atheist presenting the problem. If there is a God, why does He allow things to happen that seem to us to be evil or that contain pain and suffering for the human population? Sam Harris used this line of reasoning in his atheistic writings. He said, "An atheist is a person who believes that the murder of a single little girl, even once in a million years, casts doubt upon the idea of a benevolent God." He said on page 55 of his work, The Letter to a Christian Nation, "This is the age-old problem of theodicy, of course, and we should consider it solved. If God exists, either He can do nothing to stop the most egregious calamities, or He does not care to. God, therefore, is either impotent or evil." You see, what's being said here is that God cannot be moral if there is any evil or pain or suffering that occurs in this world. But the question that we need to then pose to the atheistic community is, where would you get an idea of morality? The problem with atheism's attack on God here is that when they say there is an objective moral standard by which we can say that some things are evil, they are positing an objective moral standard whether they like to admit it or not. And if you're positing an objective moral standard, then there has to be an objective moral standard giver. Where would you get an objective moral standard according to the philosophy of atheism? You can't get one. William Provine has pointed that out for us, and it's easy to see from his writings and statements. He understands the implications of naturalistic evolution, of atheism. He said this, "Modern science directly implies that there are no inherent moral or ethical laws, no absolute guiding principles for human society." He's quoted in Expelled as saying, "It starts by giving up an active deity. Then it gives up the hope that there's any life after death. When you give those two up, the rest of it follows fairly easily. You give up the hope that there is any immanent morality." You see what's being said there, according to Provine? The implication of atheism is that you can't say that some things are evil. You can say we don't like them. You can say we'd rather them not happen. You can say we wish things were different. But you can't say they're morally wrong. So the problem of evil, pain, and suffering quickly becomes, for the atheist, the problem of evil. Because if there is objective moral evil, then there has to be an objective moral lawgiver. Nietzsche, in his work Beyond Good and Evil, wrote this, "We believe that severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, secrecy, stoicism, tempter's art, and devilry of every kind, that everything wicked, terrible, tyrannical, predatory, and serpentine in man serves as well for the elevation of the human species as its opposite." You see what Nietzsche was saying? If evolution is true, if there is no God and humans evolved from primordial slime over millions and millions of years, what caused us to be at the level where we are? He said some of the things that caused us to get here are devilry, tempter's art, stoicism, treachery, anything bad and serpentine and predatory and tyrannical in humans. You might not like it, You might say, I wish things were different. You might say it might be better for the human species to do things not that way. But if you were to say, according to atheism, can you tell me that something is objectively, morally wrong? You can't. C.S. Lewis ran into this problem as he was searching for truth in atheism. He came in contact with the reality that atheism cannot give you a foundation for evil or rightness. Here's what he said in that regard. C.S. Lewis said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it didn't happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. You see, what Lewis understood was that if you're going to say, we have a problem of evil, you're going to have to define evil with some type of standard. And if you can say legitimately that there is objective moral evil, then there would have to be objective moral good. And if there is objective moral good, then atheism cannot be true, because as William Provine, an atheist himself, noted, atheism undermines the fact or the idea that there is any foundation for ethics. You can't have a problem of evil if you don't have a God. So, C.S. Lewis said, turns out that atheism is just too simple. If there really is evil, then there really must be good. And if there really is good, there has to be a God. Now, what you see often is when the philosophical side of this argument fails, the skeptical community will attempt to use and appeal to emotion. They will see that, okay, we don't really have a problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And if we don't have a philosophical problem, well, maybe we can present an emotional problem. And in a debate that I had with Dan Barker, and in his writings, he often says something along these lines: all you have to do is walk into a children's hospital and you will see and know that a loving God does not exist. Is that true? That all you have to do is walk into a children's hospital and you see the suffering and pain that those children are going through and you know that God doesn't exist? No, it's not true at all. In fact, when you walk into a children's hospital, what do you see? Oh, you see some pain and suffering. But what do you see the parents and the doctors and the nurses doing with those children? You see them loving them, concerned about their welfare, taking care of them, sacrificing for them. Do you know you could use that same emotional appeal? And you could say, in order to prove that there is a loving God and that there is a standard of morality, of love and fairness and kindness and goodness, all you have to do is walk into a children's hospital and you will see care and concern for those children from doctors and nurses and parents and guardians. And those parents and guardians and doctors and nurses, they know that they're not going to be able to use these children to pass on their genetic information, but they love them and they care about them and they're concerned about them anyway. And that proves that atheism cannot be true and that there must be a moral God who gave us a moral standard by which we could use things like kindness and love and goodness to take care of these children. You see how that emotional argument works? You could use it for one as well as you could use it for the other. The emotional appeal that all you got to do is walk into a children's hospital and you know that God doesn't exist, it's absolutely positively wrong. Do people walk into children's hospitals all the time and believe in God and walk out believing in God? Absolutely. In fact, what you will see is that most of the people who are voluntarily going into those children's hospitals to give comfort and care to many of those children, most of them believe in God. Now, if that is the emotional appeal, as we're looking at this next idea, if there's not a problem of evil, because atheism can't give us a standard of evil and good, then there's a problem. They say, okay, maybe we can't give you evil, but there's a problem of harm, of suffering, of pain. We can see that some harm is being done to people. Well, let's look at that idea. If you go to the Barker-Butt debate that I did back in 2009 with Dan Barker, Barker says, you can't get through life without some harm. I think we all agree that it's wrong to stick a needle into a baby. That's horrible. But if that baby needs a life-saving injection, we will cause that harm. We will do that. The baby won't understand it, but we will do that because there is a greater good. So humanistic morality understands that within certain situations, there is harm and there's a trade-off of values. You see what Barker is saying, and what the atheistic community admits, is, all right, yes, it could be morally permissible for God to allow some harm if there was a greater good. Let me read to you another statement along those lines. Barker said, and maybe right, maybe wrong, when possible, you should try to stop the pain of others. If you have to hurt someone, then hurt them as little as possible. If you do have to hurt someone, then try to stop as soon as possible. A good person does not enjoy causing harm. You see, the understanding there is that under certain conditions, it might be the case that some harm or pain or suffering might be allowed to enter the world if it brought about a greater good. So let's see how the argument is progressing here. First, they suggest we got a problem of evil, pain, and suffering. We then point out, no, you can't say we've got a problem of evil because you can't say what is evil. Then you show that they say, okay, there's not a problem of evil, there's a problem of harm and pain. And then you suggest, well, could it be morally permissible for God to allow some pain if there was a greater good? And they say, yes, it could be morally permissible for God to allow some pain if there is a greater good. But they then argue that there's just too much pain. There's too much suffering. And they have to add a word. The word that they then add is pointless. They say, yes, we see pain and suffering in this world, and it could be morally permissible for God to allow some pain and suffering in this world, but there's too much, and some of it is pointless. Let me read to you a statement by J.L. Mackie, who is a very famous atheist who has written along the lines of this problem of evil, pain, and suffering. He said that if the theist could legitimately show that the suffering in the world is in some way useful, then he said it's formally possible and its principle involves no real abandonment of our ordinary view of the opposition between good and evil. You see what he's saying there is, if you could show that there was a reason for the pain and suffering that is allowed, then you would be right. There would be no moral problem, how we understand good and evil, that could fit if there was a reason for the suffering. Now, it's not like he throws in the towel and says, okay, we give up. We as an atheistic community have admitted that some pain and suffering could be allowed, and God allows some pain and suffering. We give up, you win. No, that's not how this works. That's not how Mackie did. That's not the way that he decided to go with this. He said, yes, if there was some pain and suffering that you could show a purpose for, then that wouldn't militate against the idea of a loving, powerful God. But he says that's not what we see. What he says is we can concede that the problem of evil does not, after all, show that the central doctrines of theism are logically inconsistent with one another. But, he says, the problem therefore now recurs as the problem of unabsorbed, or read that as pointless evils. And we have as yet no way of reconciling their existence with that of a God of the traditional sort. Do you see how the argument has been altered now? We have gone from the problem of evil, and then we see, well, actually, atheism can't give us a problem of evil. And then we go to harm and suffering, And if you were to say, does any harm or suffering militate against the idea of a God? They say, no, not any harm or suffering. It could be the case that God would allow some suffering, and that would not be inconsistent with our ideas of good and evil. But then, when you ask them, okay, so you can't give us really a problem of evil, so you give us a problem of pain and suffering, but you admit that some suffering could be all right. Who is to determine how much suffering? The atheist says, when I look at the world, I see too much pointless suffering. So now they've added a new word, pointless suffering. Dan Barker pulled this same kind of tactic. He said, I'm not asking for a world that's free of pain. No atheist is asking that the world be changed or requiring that if there is a God, He be able to change it. I'm not asking for a world that's free of consequences. What I am asking for is for human beings to strive as much as possible for a world that is free of unnecessary harm. You see, what we have moved now to is the idea of unnecessary harm. They are basically saying, yes, if you could show that the pain and suffering, the harm in this world has a point, then we would be wrong. Then the problem of evil, pain, and suffering would not be a problem for you. But you can't show that it has a point. Timothy Keller has made a statement that answers this argument perfectly. Timothy Keller said this, tucked away within the assertion that the world is filled with pointless evil is a hidden premise, namely that if evil appears pointless to me, then it must be pointless. This reasoning is, of course, fallacious. Just because you can't see or imagine a good reason why God might allow something to happen doesn't mean that there can't be one. Again, we see lurking within supposedly hard-nosed skepticism and enormous faith in one's own cognitive faculties. If our minds can't plumb the depths of the universe for good answers to sufferings, well then, there can't be any. This is blind faith of a high order. You see what Timothy Keller is saying? If we get the atheistic community to admit that some suffering or pain could be justifiable, then the atheistic community says, yes, okay, that's true, but there's too much. And you say, well, how do you know there's too much? They say, well, some of it's pointless. And you ask them, pointless according to whom? Who's not seeing the point to the pain and suffering? And their response, of course, is, we're not. So what you're saying then is, if you don't see a point to the suffering and the pain in this life, then there can't be one? Well, no, that doesn't make sense at all. In fact, what Keller says is that's blind faith of a high order, isn't it? Because they're saying if we don't see it, then there must not be one. If you were to ask who would be in the very best position to decide or determine if there is a point to suffering and pain that is in this world, who would be in the best position? Dan Barker gives you the criteria by which you can decide who would be in the best position. Dan Barker says in his book, Godless, there is no big mystery to morality. Morality is simply acting with the intention to minimize harm. And the way to avoid making a mistake is to be as informed as possible about the likely consequences of the actions being considered. Now you can see what Dan Barker is saying here. He says that the way that you avoid making a mistake as it relates to a moral decision is to be as informed as possible about the likely consequences. Who would be in the best position to be as informed as possible about how much pain and suffering could be allowed that would bring about a greater good? Would it be a finite atheist who doesn't understand what will happen in the future and doesn't know all the consequences of his action? Or would it be an infinite God who knows everything, who created humans and wants what's best for them, and who knows the consequences of how much suffering will bring about how much good? Well, of course, to ask is to answer. God is in the only position to know how much suffering would be permissible. You can see then what has happened to the atheistic argument. They started out with a problem of evil, pain, and suffering. You have to alter that, because if there really is objective evil, as C.S. Lewis said, then that proves that there is objective moral good, and that proves that there's a God. So the argument is often adjusted to the problem of pain and suffering. But then when you ask them, is some suffering permissible? They say yes, some would be if you could show that there's a point. So if you then contend, well, there is a point to the suffering that you see, they say no, there's too much pointless suffering. And if you were to ask them pointless according to who, they would say pointless according to us. Do you know why they see the suffering in this life as pointless, as not being used for a greater good? Because they have missed a key concept in the Bible. If there really is a God who loves His creatures and who has endowed them with an immortal soul, then that God would prepare a world by which they could have the most benefit for the longest amount of time. See, this world is a veil of soul making. The purpose for this world is not for humans to be as comfortable as possible for as long as possible while they live on this earth. The purpose is to forge character inside of a person to prepare people for eternity. You see, if you misunderstand the purpose of something, you'll certainly misunderstand whether it's good or bad. Suppose I have in my house some decorative fruit. In fact, you can come into my house and there is a little tray on a metal piece of furniture that has 3 green pears. And suppose you go up to one of those pears and you take it off of that tray and you try to bite into it, and it's plastic. And you say, Kyle, this is ridiculous. This fruit is terrible. You can't eat this. It's no good for you. And I say, no, of course you can't eat it. Of course it's not good for you, because you're misunderstanding the point of the fruit. That fruit is not to eat. That fruit is for decoration. If you misunderstand the point, you'll always misunderstand the value of something. What is the point of our existence on this earth? Is it to be as comfortable as possible for the few years that we're going to live here? Or is it to form a character that can last through eternity, where we will live in paradise with God and have the best chance to form a relationship with God while we're here? Is it that this world is a probationary period where we're here for a little while, and the things that happen to us are in play to intentionally help us to see what's the most important? Eternal life. Yes. So you see, the problem of evil, pain, and suffering is not a problem for the Christian theist. In fact, if there really is evil, there is a problem for some group, and that's the atheistic group. But if we can show that there really is evil, then there must be good. And then when you start to see where they're trying to go with this argument, you see that not only do they admit that some harm could be good, but if you could show that there's a point to it, then they would say, yeah, there's really not a problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And when we show that the point to it is to forge character that will last through eternity, well, their accusation against God falls flat. There's no problem of evil, pain, and suffering. And as C.S. Lewis said, atheism turns out to be too simple.
This has been a presentation of Apologetics Press, an organization dedicated to the defense of New Testament Christianity. Visit us on the web at apologeticspress.org or call 800-234-8558.